the Night Queen Veil went to the temple of Lunara to ask the moon goddess to break her mating bond. She did not tell anyone where she was going. Not her attendants, not the council, not her mate. She simply rose before dawn, dressed herself in a plain, white wool dress without calling for help, and walked through the frozen palace corridors alone, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands steady in a way that suggested she had been building toward this decision for a long time and had finally arrived at it. The Temple of Lunara sat at the edge of Dravenmoor's capital city, at the place where the forest began and the city ended, where the old stone met the older trees, and the moonlight came through the canopy at angles that made everything feel sacred and slightly outside of ordinary time. Veil had been to this temple dozens of times since the mating, always with Kairan, always with the full formal attendance of an Alpha King and his queen, arriving at a sacred place together. Tonight she came alone. The High Priestess was there. She was always there. Elderly, silver-haired, the specific stillness of someone who has been in the presence of sacred things long enough that nothing surprises her. She was surprised by this. Veil knelt beneath the silver altar. The candles around her did not move. The moonlight through the high temple windows fell across her white dress, and her dark hair and her hands pressed together in the specific posture of someone who has run out of other options. "Please," she whispered, "I am asking you to break the bond." The temple went completely silent. The High Priestess stared at her with the expression of someone watching something that should not be possible happening in front of them. "Do you understand what you are asking?" Veil closed her eyes. Yes, her voice cracked softly on the single word. "I cannot breathe inside this bond anymore." Then from the shadows at the back of the temple, where the moonlight did not reach, and where no one should have been standing, because no one had followed her, another voice spoke. "Neither can I," Veil turned slowly. And there, beneath the silver light pouring through the temple windows, stood Alpha King Kairan of Dravenmoor. Her mate, the most feared wolf in the Western Territories. And for the first time since she had known him, he looked broken. "Welcome to Moon Noir. If you have ever loved someone so much that the love became the problem, this story is for you. If this is your first time here, subscribe and like. You found the right place. Let us begin." Before he became the man standing in the shadows of that temple, Kairan Drakar was a legend born from necessity. He had not chosen to be the Alpha King of the Western Territories. He had simply been the one left standing when everything else collapsed. His father died when Kairan was 17, not in battle, which would have been clean and comprehensible, in a political assassination that left the Western Territories leaderless and the surrounding powers immediately calculating what they could take in the chaos. Kairan did not have time to grieve. He had a territory to hold, so he held it, not with warmth, not with the charismatic leadership of a man who had been trained for authority from birth and had time to develop the specific human qualities that make power feel like safety to the people beneath it. With force, with discipline, with the specific terrible efficiency of a 17-year-old boy who had learned in the space of 1 week that the world would take everything you loved if you gave it a moment of weakness. He spent the following years becoming exactly the man the Western Territories required. Enormous even among wolves, which was saying something. Cold-eyed in the ways of someone who had learned to keep their emotional responses below the surface where they could not be used against them. Controlled in every movement, every decision, every word spoken in public. The kind of man entire kingdoms obeyed before he finished a sentence. Not because they loved him, because he made them understand, without ever saying it directly, that the alternative to obeyings was something they did not want to encounter. The kingdom did not love Kairan Drakar, but it was safe. And in the Western Territories, after what had happened to his father, safety was more valuable than love. He governed alone for 11 years. Not because he chose solitude, because solitude was simply the texture of a life organized entirely around survival. There was no space in the architecture he had built for anything that was not useful. anything that required him to be something other than what the territory needed. He did not know he was lonely. He had been too busy to find out. Then Lunara gave him a mate, Vale Avren, a healer from the southern reaches of Dravenmoor, the specific southern reaches where the forest was warmest, and the communities were small enough that everyone knew each other, and the particular pace of life was slower and more human than anything Kairan had ever inhabited. She was visiting the capital for a healers' gathering when the bond found them. They were in the same corridor at the same time, passing each other on the way to different destinations. And the bond arrived without warning, the way Lunara bonds always did, the specific primal recognition of something the soul has been searching for without knowing it was searching. Kairan stopped walking. His entire body went still, with the specific stillness of a man who has just had something happen to him that completely bypasses every defense he has spent 11 years constructing. Vale turned around. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and warm and completely unafraid of him, in a way that nobody had been unafraid of him in 11 years, she said, with the specific directness of someone who had not yet learned that powerful people preferred to be approached carefully. You felt that too. Not a question, a confirmation. Kairan looked at her for a long time. Then he said the first honest thing he had said out loud in longer than he could remember. Yes. And the Alpha King of the Western Territories stood in a palace corridor and understood, for the first time in 11 years, what it felt like to be entirely disarmed. The bond between them was immediate and overwhelming, and the most terrifying thing Kairan had ever experienced, because it meant there was now some things in his life that he could not control. He could not control wanting her. He could not control needing her. He could not control the specific physical pain that arrived when she was not close enough. For a man who had spent 11 years making sure that nothing existed in his life that he could not control, the bond was both the greatest thing that had ever happened to him, and the beginning of everything that would eventually bring them both to their knees in a temple before a goddess asking to be released from each other. The kingdom called it destiny. It was. The mistake was believing that destiny was the same as simple. Kairan loved her immediately and completely, and in the specific way of a man who has been starving for a very long time and has suddenly been given food. Not with restraint, not with the careful, measured love of someone who understood that love, like everything else, required management. With everything, the palace was renovated around her preferences within the first month. Her healing chambers were given the best natural light in the building. Her favorite foods appeared at every meal without her needing to request them. Guards accompanied her everywhere she went, not because she was in danger, but because the thought of her being in any proximity to danger made Kairan physically ill. He learned everything about her. The exact rhythm of her breathing when she was relaxed versus when she was worried. The specific difference between her real laugh and her polite laugh. The way she tucked her left hand under her chin when she was thinking deeply about something. The fact that she needed the window open slightly, even in winter, because she had grown up in the southern forest where the air always moved. He opened the window every night before she came to bed. She did not know he did this. He did not tell her. He simply did it because it was something she needed, and providing things she needed before she had to ask for them was, in Kairan's understanding, what love looked like. And because of the Lunara bond, he felt her emotions constantly. This was presented to them by the High Priestess as one of the great gifts of a sacred mating. True mates feel each other. They are never truly alone. The bond is a constant presence of the other person's inner world, a permanent, intimate connection that ordinary relationships can never achieve. What the High Priestess did not explain, because perhaps she did not know, was what that constant connection meant for a man like Kairan. For a man who had spent 11 years managing every variable in his environment, who had built his entire governance around the principle that awareness prevented catastrophe, The ability to feel Vial's emotions directly was not simply a gift. It was information, and information for Charon was something to be acted upon. When Vial felt anxious, Charon felt it immediately, and immediately began working to identify and eliminate the source of the anxiety. When Vial felt sad, Charon felt it as something close to panic, and immediately reorganized his attention toward her until the sadness passed. When Vial felt tired, Charon felt it as urgency and immediately began clearing her schedule and adjusting the demands on her time. He was, by any observable standard, the most attentive mate in the history of the Western Territories. He was also, though neither of them understood this yet, slowly making it impossible for Vial to have an emotional experience that did not immediately become about him. Every sadness became his emergency. Every anxiety became his project. Every moment of tiredness became his failure. And slowly, without either of them deciding this was happening, Vial began managing her emotions before she let herself feel them. Not consciously, in the specific way of someone who has learned that their private inner weather affects the atmosphere of an entire palace. She would feel the beginning of sadness, and then, before the sadness could fully form, she would become aware of Charon feeling her feeling it, and of the specific quality of tension that entered the bond when he sensed her distress, and she would find herself redirecting, suppressing, managing, not for him, because of him. Because loving him had become, without anyone intending it, the work of continuously monitoring her own emotional state to ensure it did not cause him distress. Loving him began to feel like a second full-time occupation. Not because he was cruel, because he needed her too much. And need, when it is large enough and present enough and constant enough, becomes its own form of weight. The palace envied Queen Vial constantly. The Alpha King was publicly devoted to her in ways that made the court speak of their bond as the most beautiful thing in a generation. He stood close to her at every formal gathering, touched her hand across table surfaces during council meetings in a gesture so habitual it seemed involuntary, looked physically calmer, more human, more like something other than the cold, feared ruler of the Western Territories, whenever she was in the same room. Women across Dravenmore dreamed about being loved with that specific intensity, but the servants noticed things the court did not. Queen Vial had stopped singing while she walked through the healing gardens in the morning. She had done this when she first arrived, a habit from the southern forest, where the healers sang Swidurk because the sound was good for the plants, and because singing was simply what you did when you moved through spaces you loved. She had stopped. Not because Charon asked her to, because one morning she was singing and she felt, through the bond, the specific quality of Charon's attention sharpening toward her. He was 3 floors above her, in his war council, and he felt her singing, and the feeling translated through the bond as something she could only describe as hunger. And she had stopped singing, because the hunger made her feel watched, in a way the actual watching never did. She had stopped painting in the open studio. She had loved to paint, not professionally, simply as a way of being in her own mind for a few hours while her hands did something. She moved her paints to a private room. Then, she stopped its painting entirely, because even in the private room she was aware of the bond, and the bond was aware of her, and the specific quality of absorption she needed to paint properly was incompatible with the constant background awareness of being felt. She stopped laughing freely at royal dinners, not because she was unhappy. She was happy. That was the part nobody would have believed. But free laughter moved through the bond, and when it did he felt it, every time, without fail, and his attention would shift toward her the way it always shifted, heavy, warm, consuming, requiring her to receive it, requiring her to respond to it. And the responding required a presence, a fullness, that was incompatible with the lightness that had produced the laughter in the first place. She could not laugh completely and then turn toward him completely. There was not enough of her for both, so she stopped laughing completely. The most specific moment came on a winter afternoon in the second year. Not an argument, not a cruelty, simply an afternoon, simply winter. Simply the specific quiet way that the most important things arrive. She had received a letter from her sister in the southern forest. Good news, a child born healthy. Specific, uncomplicated joy of something good arriving without complication. Vale read the letter and felt the joy arrive in her chest, and then, before it had fully formed, she felt the bond respond to it. Keran was in the war council 2 floors above her. She felt his attention shift through the bond, the way it always shifted when something moved in her. The specific quality of his reaching. The beginning of his emotional movement toward her. She put the letter down. She took a breath. She waited until the joy had reduced itself to something manageable. Something that would not move through the bond strongly enough to pull him out of a war council. Then she picked the letter up again and finished reading it. It took her 3 days to tell him about her sister's child. Not because she forgot, because she needed those 3 days to find a version of the joy that would not immediately become his. She had not decided to do this. She had simply done it. That was when she began to understand that something was wrong, not with him, with what loving him had quietly required her to become. She seemed careful now, as though part of her mind was always occupied managing the emotional atmosphere around her husband, rather than simply living inside her own experience. The kingdom called their bond legendary. They secretly experienced it as the specific exhaustion of someone who had not been entirely alone inside their own head for 2 years. The realization did not arrive dramatically, not during an argument, not during cruelty, not during any of the large visible events that people expect to mark turning points. It arrived during a winter banquet in the 3rd year of their mating. The banquet was a formal, political occasion. 12 noble families from across the Western Territories. The specific performed sociability of people who needed to be in the same room and had agreed to behave as though they were there voluntarily. Vale had been managing her emotional presence through the bond for 3 hours, keeping herself at a specific internal temperature. Not too happy, because happiness moved through the bond in a way that produced in Kairan a kind of reaching that she found exhausting to receive. Not too tired, because tiredness produced his panic. Not too detached, because detachment produced his anxiety about whether the bond felt different to her. The specific narrow corridor of emotional states that were safe to inhabit in his presence. She was standing near the window speaking to the wife of one of the northern lords. A pleasant woman, warm. The kind of person Vale might have found genuinely enjoyable in a different context. The woman smiled at her. "You are the luckiest woman alive." Vale opened her mouth to agree, then stopped, because the sentence had landed differently than it should have. She stood at the window of the banquet hall with snow visible outside, and the warmth of the gathering around her, and the bond present and constant as always, and she tried to access the feeling that would make that sentence true. She thought about the painting she had finished that morning. She had been working on it for 3 weeks. A winter landscape. The specific quality of light on snow just before dawn. She had finished it at the exact moment the light changed, and the feeling of completion had arrived with the specific sharp satisfaction of a thing done correctly. She had stood back from the canvas, and then, before she had fully received the satisfaction, she had felt Charon through the bond. He was in his chambers, dressing for the day, not paying particular attention to the bond. But the bond was always there, and the satisfaction of the finished painting was moving through it toward him, before she had finished feeling it herself. She had put down her brush. She had left the studio. The painting was finished, and she had not let herself feel it completely, because feeling things completely was something that happened in the bond now, before it happened in herself. She stood at the banquet window and understood something she had been refusing to understand for months. She was experiencing her own life at half volume, not because Karen demanded it, because the bond transmitted everything at full volume, and there was only so much emotional experience available, and she had been unconsciously rationing her own feelings to keep enough in reserve for the transmission. She could not find the feeling that would make luckiest woman alive true. Not because it did not exist, because she had been living at half volume for so long that the full feeling had become inaccessible. She excused herself from the banquet. She went to the palace gardens. The snow was falling, and the fountain was frozen, and the night was very cold and very quiet, and for the first times in 3 years, she was alone with her own emotional state without managing it. She sat beside the frozen fountain and she cried. Not performed crying. The specific private crying of someone who has finally found a space where the crying does not immediately become someone else's emergency. It lasted a long time. Then she heard his footsteps. He had felt her leave through the bond, had felt the shift in her emotional state, had excused himself from the banquet and come to the garden because that was what he always did when he felt something move in her. He crouched beside her in the snow. His face carried the specific panic that her distress always produced in him. What is wrong? Vale looked at him. She had been managing what she said to him for 3 years, testing things before she said them, removing anything that might produce the panic that was currently on his face. Tonight she was too tired to manage. I need one place inside myself that still belongs only to me. Karan went completely still. The snow fell around them. The bond between them was very quiet suddenly, in a way that bonds were never quiet. He looked at her for a long time, and for the first time, the Alpha King of the Western Territories understood that the woman he loved, more than anything he had ever been given, was drowning, not in danger, not in unhappiness, in him, in the specific, relentless, all-consuming presence of his love. He had loved her so completely that he had left no room inside the love for her to simply exist. He sat with that beside the frozen fountain while the snow continued, and neither of them spoke. Vale went to the temple of Lunara 3 weeks after the garden. She went alone, or she tried to. The bond was not something you could simply leave behind when you walked out of a building. Karan felt her moving through the bond, felt the specific quality of purpose in her movement that distinguished this from an ordinary early morning, felt something in the bond that he could not name, but that produced in him a cold, focused fear he had not felt since he was 17 years old, watching his father die. He followed her. He arrived at the temple quietly, entering through the side passage that connected to the forest path, and stood in the shadows at the back where the moonlight did not reach. He arrived just in time to hear the words, "Please," her voice, so quiet, break the bond. The temple went entirely still. The high priestess looked at Vael with the expression of someone watching, something sacred being violated. The Lunara bond was not something that was asked to be broken. In all the years of the priestess's service, she had never heard those words spoken by a true mate. Karan stood in the shadows. He could feel through the bond exactly what Vael felt in that moment. Not anger, not hatred, exhaustion. The specific, profound exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally arrived at the place where they can put it down. He felt that, and he understood something he had not been able to see from inside the bond. She was not asking to be free of him because she did not love him. She was asking to be free of him because she had lost herself inside loving him, and those were not the same thing, but they were both real. The high priestess spoke. "Do you understand what you are asking? The breaking of a Lunara bond is not a painless thing. It is not a simple dissolution. It is a severing at the soul level. Both parties carry the scar of it for the rest of their lives." Vael looked at the altar. "I understand." Then she said the sentence that broke him more completely than anything that had ever happened to him, including the death of his father and the 11 years of governing alone, and every war and every loss and every moment of the specific profound loneliness of Lee's being Karan Drakar. "I do not know where I end anymore." Karan stood in the shadows and looked at his mate. She was trembling, not from cold, The temple was warm, from the specific physical response of a nervous system that had been organized around managing his emotional experience for so long that the act of finally not managing it, of kneeling at an altar and saying what she actually felt without filtering it first, had produced in her body the specific trembling of a system that did not know how to operate without the suppression. He had done that, not with orders, not with cruelty, with love so large and so constant and so completely present that her nervous system had quietly reorganized itself around the management of it. He had trained her without meaning to. The way you train something without meaning to when you are large enough and constant enough, and the consequences of your emotional state are significant enough that the thing being trained does not have a choice. She was trembling at the altar of the moon goddess, asking to be released. And her body was trembling not from the asking, but from the specific unfamiliar experience of feeling something all the way through, without stopping it halfway. He stood in the shadows and understood completely what he had done. He stepped out of the shadows. Both Vael and the priestess turned toward him. He looked at his mate. He had been inside the bond for 3 years, had been so entirely inside it that he had not been able to see it from outside it. But standing in the temple of Lunara, in the early morning, with the moonlight through the high windows, and his mate kneeling at the altar asking to be released, he could finally see it. The careful smiles she had learned to produce at exactly the right moment. The specific emotional neutrality she maintained in his presence that he had interpreted as peace, but now understood was suppression. The way she never cried in front of him until the crying was already almost finished. The fact that she had stopped singing, he had not noticed. 3 years, 3 years beside her. 3 years feeling every emotion move through her, before she had finished feeling it herself. And he had not noticed she stopped singing, because he had been so inside the bond, so consumed by what she felt, that he had forgotten to simply watch her, to simply see her, the woman. Not the feeling, not the bond, her. He looked at her for a long time. The candles around them did not move. The moonlight held, the temple waited. And then he said the only honest thing available to him in that moment. The only thing that was completely true. Neither can I. Karan spent 3 days alone after the temple, not in council, not managing the territory, not doing any of the things that had constituted his life, before Vael arrived in it and after. Simply in his private chambers, with the door closed and the bond present and quiet between them, the way it had been quiet in the garden, and the way it had been quiet in the temple. He thought about what she had said. I do not know where I end anymore. He thought about what he knew about himself. He had spent 11 years before her creating structures of control, because control was the thing that stood between him and losing everything again. Between him and the specific devastating experience of being 17 years old and watching his father die and understanding that the world took things without warning and without mercy. The bond had felt, when it arrived, like the solution to that problem. Here was something he could not lose because it was sacred and permanent and blessed by Lunara herself. Here was something he could protect because he could feel it at all times, and therefore always know when it needed protecting. Here was something that could not simply leave because the bond held them both. He sat with that for a long time. Then he understood something that required more honesty than he had been able to access inside the daily architecture of their life together. He had loved her, partly because the bond made losing her feel impossible. He had loved her, partly because a Lunara bond meant she could not simply leave the way his father had left, the way the safety of his childhood had left, the way every certain thing in his life had eventually left. He had loved her genuinely and completely, and he had also loved the bond's guarantee. And he had not been able to tell the difference between those two things until she knelt in a temple and asked for the guarantee to be removed. On the 3rd night he went to her chambers, not with the urgency that had characterized most of his movements toward her since the mating. not with the specific reaching quality that she had described, without naming as one of the things that exhausted her. Simply with the specific quiet of a man who has understood something he cannot understand and is not sure what to do with the understanding except to be honest about it. Vale was sitting at the window. She looked at him when he entered. She did not say anything. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of her chamber, and he sat down and he wrote something on a piece of heavy formal paper, and he pressed the seal of the Alpha King of the Western Territories into the wax at the bottom. He brought it to her, she took it, she read it. It was a royal decree, formal in every legal particular, witnessed by his seal, establishing Vile Avron's complete freedom from the requirements of the mating bond. Her freedom of movement, her freedom from the bondsman's claims on her emotional presence, her legal right to pursue dissolution of the bond through the Temple of Lunara with the full formal support of the Alpha King rather than against his will, her right to leave if she chose to, her right to stay if she chose to. Both options legally protected by the most powerful document he could produce. Vale looked at the decree for a long time. Then she looked at him. His voice shook slightly when he spoke. Not because he was afraid of what she would do, because for the first time he was offering something with genuinely no guarantee attached to it. If loving me feels like imprisonment, he said, then I would rather lose you than keep you in a cage I built while believing I was building a home. Vale held the decree. She did not speak immediately. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone receiving something they had stopped believing was possible and are trying to understand if it is real before they let themselves respond to it. Karen waited. He was very good at waiting when there was nothing else to do. That was the first truly selfless thing he had ever done for her, and both of them knew it. The bond was not broken immediately. Lunara bonds did not dissolve on request. They faded slowly when both souls released them willingly, the way a fire goes out slowly when you stop feeding it. The warmth diminishing by degrees rather than extinguishing all at once. And in those months of slow fading, something unexpected happened. Karen changed. Not dramatically, not with announcement or performance or the specific visible effort of a man trying to demonstrate that he was different. Quietly, he stopped monitoring the bond constantly for changes in her emotional state. This was the most difficult thing he had ever done, including the 11 years of governing the Western Territories alone after his father died, because the monitoring had become so automatic that stopping it felt like removing a sense, like suddenly being unable to see in one direction. He did it anyway. He stopped entering rooms she was in with the reaching quality that she had described without naming. He began instead simply arriving in the same space as her, the way you arrive in a space where someone you respect is present. Acknowledged but not overwhelming. He stopped treating her sadness as his emergency. This one, he had to learn to do differently each time, because the instinct was so deeply embedded in both the bond and in his fundamental architecture as a person who managed threats that it kept returning in new forms. He would catch himself starting to ask, what is wrong, and stop. Starting to reorganize his schedule around her tiredness and stop. Starting to feel the bond's awareness of her and then act on that awareness and stop. He stopped acting on it. He let her have it. The emotion, the sadness, the tiredness, the quiet, whatever it was. He let her have it without making it about him. And slowly, over the following weeks, something happened that he had not anticipated. Vale began singing again, not because he asked. Not because she was performing recovery for his benefit. Simply because she was walking through the healing gardens one morning, and the song was there. And for the first time in years, the bond was quiet enough that she could simply sing without it immediately becoming his experience. He heard it from the upper window of his war room. He stood at the window and listened and did not go to the gardens. That was perhaps the hardest thing he did in all those months, and the most important. She began spending time in the open studio again. He could see the light from the studio window, in the evenings, the warm amber of a lamp burning late while she worked. He did not go to the studio, did not press the bond for information about what she was painting. He simply let the light be there, let her have the studio and the lamp and the painting without making any part of it his. And strangely, as the monitoring reduced and the space increased and the bond stopped being something that operated as a constant, two-way transmission of emotional data, something else began to happen. Vale began choosing him, not because the bond required it, because she wanted to. She appeared at his war council one afternoon and sat beside him without being invited, not to manage his emotional state, simply because she had been working in the studio all morning and had come to the end of what she wanted to do there, and had thought about where she wanted to go next, and had chosen, voluntarily, to be where he was. She touched his hand first during a formal dinner before he reached for hers. She came to him one evening and sat beside him in the specific comfortable silence of someone who has chosen to be in a space rather than obligated to be in it. He noticed all of these things. He said nothing about any of them, because saying something would have been, in some small way, another form of reaching. And he was learning to let things arrive without reaching for them. Love freely given felt entirely different from love that the bond had made inevitable. He was only beginning to understand how different. Vale did not decide to fall in love with Karen again. She simply discovered, in the space that the reduced monitoring had created, that she already was, not the bond's love, not the specific primal recognition of a Lunara mating that had arrived the moment they touched in the palace corridor. Something she had built herself, from choice, in the months since the temple. She discovered the way you discover something that has been present for a while without your awareness. The morning she woke up and realized that her first thought was of him without anxiety attached to it. The evening she found herself telling him about something that had happened in the healing gardens, not because the bond was pulling her toward him, but because he was the person she wanted to tell. The afternoon she realized she was laughing freely in his presence, not checking first, simply laughing, and looking across at him when the laugh passed, and seeing that he was not reaching toward her with the bond, or trying to become part of the laughter, or monitoring her to ensure it would continue. He was simply watching her with the specific expression of a man who has learned something about what love looks like when it is not trying to hold on. She went to the temple of Lunara again, alone, in the early morning, the same time she had gone before. The high priestess was there. She looked at Vale with the careful expression of someone who was not certain which version of this visit she was about to witness. Has the bond weakened? Vale considered this. No, she said, not weakened, changed. The priestess waited. What I came here to break, Vale said quietly, was not the bond. She looked toward the moonlight coming through the high temple windows. The same moonlight that had been there the night she knelt and asked to be released. It was the fear inside it, she said. His fear, my disappearance inside his need. The specific weight of being loved by someone who needed the bond's guarantee more than he needed to actually know me. The priestess was quiet. And now? She asked finally. Vale looked at the altar. Now, she said, he is learning to love me without the guarantee. She paused. And I am learning what it feels like to choose him. The priestess looked at her for a long moment. What I really wanted, Vale said, was not freedom from him. Her voice was soft and certain simultaneously. It was freedom beside him. Caron did not know Vale had gone to the temple a second time until she told him. She told him that evening. He was waiting outside her chambers when she returned. Not because he had tracked her through the bond, because waiting outside her chambers in the evenings had become something he did now. Not to monitor her, but because it was where he wanted to be at the end of the day, and because he had learned that wanting to be somewhere and going there was allowed even without a guarantee of what he would find when he arrived. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him where she had been, and what she had said to the priestess, and what the priestess had asked, and what she had answered. Kieran listened. He had become much better at simply listening over the preceding months, at receiving things without immediately needing to act on them, or respond to them, or incorporate them into a management plan. He listened until she finished. Then he was quiet for a moment. She waited. He looked at her. "What I felt through the bond when I followed you to the temple the first time," he said. "I felt your exhaustion, and I understood it completely, because I recognized it from something inside myself that I had not been willing to name." Vale looked at him. "I had been using the bond," he said, "as a guarantee against loss, against the specific experience of having something sacred taken from me, the way everything sacred was taken from me when I was 17 years old." He paused. "I loved you completely, and I also loved that the bond meant I could not completely lose you, and I had not been able to see the difference between those two things." He looked at his hands. "Understanding it," he said, "does not undo what it cost you." "I know," Vale said. He looked up at her. "But I am trying," he said, "without the guarantee, without the bond's promise that you will stay, without knowing what you will choose tomorrow or the day after." He held her gaze with the specific steady quality of a man who has learned to stand in uncertainty without needing to eliminate it. "I am trying to love you in a way that leaves you room to be entirely yourself." Vale looked at him for a long time. Then she took his hand, not because the bond told her to, because she chose to. And for the first time since the mating, the Alpha King of the Western Territories cried, not from relief that she was staying, from the specific overwhelming experience of the chosen, freely, without guarantee, by the person he loved most in the world. The bond did not break. In the months that followed, it changed. Not in its sacred nature, not in the specific primal recognition of Lunara's choosing that had arrived the moment they touched in the palace corridor 3 years earlier. In its quantity, the constant monitoring stopped. Not because Kieran stopped caring what Vale felt, but because he learned to trust that what she felt was hers to feel first, and his to know only when she chose to share it. The bond was still there. The connection was still there. But he stopped living inside it, like a man watching a horizon for signs of storm. He let the horizon simply be a horizon. Vale started singing again every morning, not always, not performatively. Simply, when the song was there, and the morning was right for it. She sang in the healing gardens, and sometimes in the open studio, and sometimes in the corridors of the palace, when she was moving from one place to another, and not thinking about it. Kieran heard her sometimes. He never told her. He simply let it be there, let her have it completely. The singing, and the gardens, and the studio, and the morning light, and everything else that belonged to her, before it ever belonged to anything between them. She began telling him things, not because the bond was transmitting her experience to him, because she chose to transmit it herself. She told him about the plants in the healing gardens that were struggling in the cold and what she was doing about it. She told him about a healer from the Southern Territories who had sent her a letter about a new approach to treating fever sickness and what she thought about it. She told him about the painting she had been working on for 3 weeks and what it was trying to do and why it was not doing it yet. He listened. He asked questions. Real questions, from genuine curiosity, rather than the monitoring questions he had previously asked, which were less about understanding her inner life and more about assessing her emotional state. He learned things about her he had not known in 3 years of being bonded to her. She learned things about him she had not known either, because when the bond was not operating as a constant transmission of emotional data, they had to actually tell each other things. And telling each other things, it turned out, was its own form of intimacy that the bond had been bypassing. One evening, she came to find him in his war council chamber, after the council had ended, and he was alone with his papers and the fire. She sat across from him. She did not say anything immediately. He looked up from his papers. She was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who is about to say something they have been preparing, without entirely knowing they were preparing it. I loved you when the bond arrived, she said. I loved you completely, and I did not choose it, and I resented that I did not choose it even while the love was real. He looked at her. I love you now, she said, and I am choosing it every day, deliberately, with full knowledge of who you are, and what it cost us to get here. She held his gaze. That is different. He looked at her for a long time. I know, he said. She looked at the fire. Do not stop, she said quietly. The trying, the space, the waiting without reaching. I will not, he said. She looked back at him, then she smiled. Not the careful managed smile he had received for 3 years. The real one. The one that was there from the beginning. The one the bond had never been able to produce because it could not be produced. It could only be given, freely. The Temple of Lunara still stands at the edge of the capital city of Dravenmore. The High Priestess still keeps her vigil, and in the years that followed, she would tell anyone who asked about the night. The Queen came to ask for the bond to be broken, not as a cautionary tale, as the story of 2 people who discovered the most sacred thing about a Lunara bond was not its permanence. It was the choice to stay inside it, every day, without the guarantee. Take a moment with that. Then tell me which moment got you. The garden, the temple, the decree. I do not know where I end anymore. She experienced her own life at half volume. She started singing again, freedom beside him. The hand she took first. He cried from being chosen. Tell me which one. I read every single one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story is already waiting. Until then, take care of yourself, and remember, the most powerful thing about love is not that it holds you. It is that you choose to stay. Moon Noir.